and welcome back to Lab Presentation 5. We're starting in your lab manual with figure 51.4, and this is on page 395. Take just a minute and orient yourself to this figure. Notice then at the center we have an ovary, and within the ovary you can see a bunch of structures and a bunch of arrows that we're going to go over. Off to the left, you can see that that ovary is anchored in part by an ovarian ligament. And off to the right, notice we have a fallopian tube with its fimbriae. You'll see within the ovary, we have structures called follicles. And notice as you go from a primordial follicle to other stages of follicular development, so find a primordial follicle labeled for you towards the left part of the ovary. And then again, as we go from one type of follicle to a progressively larger and larger and larger and more complex follicles, keep in mind that in each case, a follicle contains a single egg cell. Follicles always contain, for each follicle, a single egg cell. The other thing to keep in mind as we're going through this process of follicular development and ovulation and what happens after ovulation, the other thing to keep in mind here is that if you take a look at the numbers, starting with number 1 to number 2 and to number 3 and so on, and if you take a look at the corresponding arrows between these structures, notice the arrows are labeled as representing time. So this is a sequence of events being shown here within this single figure. But this doesn't mean that the structures move around in a circle. So let's start with the primordial follicles, left-hand portion of the ovary again, and notice these are labeled for you. And that term primordial just means young or early. And so these are early follicles, if you will. Note that structure number 1 is a primary follicle. And again, you've done the labeling on this, so you can check your answers if you need to down below the figure. But again, then we have number 1, a primary follicle. So the primordial follicle has developed into a primary follicle, and actually possibly a group of primordial follicles has developed into primary follicles. But in any case, a primary follicle then, a later stage of development than a primordial follicle. You'll see within that primary follicle a single egg cell, though it's not labeled for you. And then now, as follicular development continues, look at structure 2. And so now we have a follicle, and within that follicle, a primary oocyte, structure number 2, a primary oocyte has been labeled. That term oocyte literally means egg cell. So when you hear oo, it implies egg. And an oocyte then is an egg cell. And if we follow the arrows along now, notice as time goes on, down to structure number 3 towards the bottom part of the figure, the bottom middle part of the figure. And number 3 then is a mature antral follicle. Mature, meaning it's just well developed, it's gone through this process of development. Antral will come back to. But notice this mature antral follicle is a large structure, again containing a single egg cell, containing a single oocyte. And then if you follow the arrow to the next part of the diagram, notice number 8 up at the top is labeled an ovulation site. And ovulation simply refers to the release of an egg cell. And notice now you can see that egg cell being released, and you can see that egg cell is surrounded by a clump of other cells. And now just follow the arrow coming off to the right and in the upper portion now of the oviduct. And so now we're just taking a closer look at that structure that's been released at ovulation. And some of the labeled portions then of that structure that's been released. First of all, number 7, and if you check your label down below, number 7 is a secondary oocyte. And so now we've gone from a primary oocyte in number 2 to a secondary oocyte in number 7. And you can think of that term secondary as implying partly developed. You can think of that term secondary as implying more developed than the primary oocyte. And this will have to do with the process called meiosis that you will learn about in lecture. So number again, a secondary oocyte has been released during ovulation. Number 6 then, notice that that secondary oocyte is surrounded by a structure called a zona pellucida. Just to preview, when we take a look at the next video, which is not the miracle of life, which you've already watched, but rather which is life's greatest miracle, and you'll see quite a bit of reference to this zona pellucida, and the narrator will simply call it the zona. So again, just a heads up that this zona pellucida, you will learn more about it in that second video. Notice also then, going further out now away from the oocyte and then going further away from the zona, now we have a clump of cells called the corona radiata. So corona, think sun-shaped. Radiata, the cells kind of radiating out from the center. So again, number 5, the corona radiata. And you don't really need a lot of notes here, but when you hear reference made to supporting cells in conjunction with an oocyte, this corona radiata is a clump of so-called supporting cells. And then finally, in this structure that's been released at ovulation, notice now number 4 is a very small structure called the first polar body. And again, you'll learn more about this in lecture when you guys go over meiosis. Let's go back now to that point of ovulation, to that ovulation site, and notice that when the secondary oocyte is released, along with these other surrounding structures that we've talked about, there's still a portion of the follicle left behind. And so if you follow that next arrow saying time, and notice now the arrow is going to what's left behind after ovulation, what's left behind within the ovary, and you can see then that this yellow structure, number 9, you've labeled the corpus luteum. Corpus, body, structure, luteum implying yellow. So this yellowish structure remains behind within the ovary after ovulation. And then notice over time again, the corpus luteum degenerates, decays, if you will, kind of shrivels up into a smaller white structure, and this is the corpus albicans, the albicans implying white. Let's stop here with presentation 5, and to preview then lab presentation 6, we'll be looking at figure 51.6, and we'll be looking at figure 51.7.